It ain't about how fast I get there, and it ain't about what's waiting on the other side. It's the climb.
It's the climb.
And I bet Cyrus never had any idea how relevant that song was to psychology and organizational behavior. But we're going to talk more about it today. Enjoy. What is going on YouTube? Jamie Potter here, PhD in organizational behavior from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. My goal in this channel is to unlock the value of research for organizations. And this week I'm diving into kind of a complex, abstract topic, and that is the idea of possible selves. So throughout my PhD, as well as beforehand and since, I was mostly interested in kind of the more, as I saw it, concrete topics like work productivity and motivation and engagement. So it was kind of fun this week to dive into some of these more abstract topics again. And this one being the idea of possible selves. What I'm going to do in this video is first kind of explain the history of possible selves, starting from the beginning, but then really get into how this is made concrete, sort of tying the abstract idea of a possible self to these more concrete things like my work success, my academic success, and such. So first off, possible selves. What are we even talking about with this? So the concept first came to be in 1986 from the very famous Hazel Marcus of the University of Michigan, who, interestingly enough, I won't go on too much of a tangent, became quite famous for her paper 5 years later in 1991 about independent versus interdependent self-construals, and specifically how these self-construals differ across cultures, namely in sort of Western civilization, the idea of an independent self-construal is more prevalent, whereas in Eastern cultures, the self-control is much more interdependent, and she sort of dives into this in a very comprehensive, very interesting paper that shows by having these different self-controls, there are a number of consequences for the self in terms of motivation and cognition and our emotions, but even very low-level ideas like our perceptions of the world differ depending on these self-controls. So tangent aside, in 1986, Hazel Marcus, along with Polonarius, dove into the idea of possible selves. And what they were initially trying to do here is dig into the self-concept a bit more. So self-concept, again, a bit of an abstract idea, but it's sort of our knowledge of ourselves. How do we think about ourselves? What is our identity? How does that change over time? And they realized that what we're sort of missing in that discussion is part of our self-knowledge is who we want to become in the future, and sort of these cognitive manifestations we have in our head of who we may become. You know, I have sort of a vision of, you know, in 20 years, I'm going to be this person. I'm going to look this way. This is the job I'm going to be doing. These are the relationships I'm going to have. This is the house I'm going to be living in. Again, it's this idea of I'm actually seeing myself, this person in the future, and now, between now and then, I'm going to try to get there. And so, you know, in this very interesting theoretical paper in 1986, Hazel Marcus dove into this idea of possible selves. So again, pretty abstract at this point, but the literature since then that's sort of built on this idea of possible selves has become very, very interesting, at least to me. So let's see what's happened since. So first off, one of the most famous papers of all time, in my view, a 1999 paper by Herminia Ibarra of the INSEAD school in France. She dove into this idea, sort of building on possible selves, of how do these possible selves come to be over time, right? We have them sort of in our self-concept, in our cognition, but how do we actually get there slowly over time? In other words, how does identity form in this way? And what she discovers in this paper, so I should step back a bit. She was a Harvard Business School professor, a very young Harvard Business School professor, and that is quite a job to have. You are not only teaching the best and brightest, the future business leaders of the world, but you're also doing it with this pretty complex teaching method called the case method, which many will be familiar with, anybody that got an MBA. And it can be very tricky to teach because it's very free-flowing. It's essentially a conversation, but you have to be incredibly well prepared to kind of manage, let's say 50 to 80 MBAs in a room, having this free-flowing discussion about a topic. And oftentimes HBS will bring in the CEOs who are sort of the protagonists of these cases.
You're entering the market for aspartame. For the first time, you're facing NutraSweet with competition. And you've got to ask yourself, how do I think NutraSweet is going to respond?
So all in all, being a professor in this environment is super tricky. And so Herminia Ibarra, as this young professor there, was thinking, how do I become this professor that I want to be? How do I become this dynamic, charismatic, extroverted Harvard Business School professor? And what she came up with, she sort of started thinking about her identity and thinking about, what am I doing to become this? And she came up with this concept, not of possible selves, but provisional selves. She realized the process that she was following, and she's since become a very famous, very incredible professor, now at INSEAD, as I mentioned. But what she was realizing that she was doing is she was kind of observing others, these role models. She was looking at this professor, this tenured professor, and going, oh wow, I really love what they do. They're so dynamic, I wish I could be that. And she realized in looking at them, she would then sort of try on certain parts of their behavior, parts of their identity. She would try on these provisional selves. In other words, it's something, look at a role model, let me try that for a little bit and see if it sticks. And the way you see if it sticks sort of in a work environment is, does that feel right for me? It's sort of this self-feedback, as well as feedback from others, right? So as you're becoming a professional, and actually in this paper, she looks at a lot of consultants, right, who go through multiple stages in their career. They start out as individual contributors before moving to managers of small consulting teams, before moving to in sort of this more client advisory role, business development role, where they're constantly dealing with clients very directly, oftentimes CEOs, and they really need a lot of panache, very different than when they started, where it's just sort of heads down in Excel and PowerPoint. And so how does this transition happen? And they realize a lot of it is sort of seeing these role models, these partners, these senior partners who are so charismatic, and you try that on for a little bit. Just like this shirt, this nice shirt that I got from Groupon. You try it on for a minute, you see if you like it. I happen to love this shirt, so I'm gonna keep wearing it. But even in this idea of identity, this very complex idea, you can also try on different identities as you're growing as a professional. And it's really pretty low risk, as is buying this $4 Groupon shirt. I may like it a lot and then keep it on, and people will say, nice shirt, Jamie. Well, at least I thought it was a nice shirt before I realized it's a $4 Groupon shirt. With identities, you can do the same. I try it on, I try being a little charismatic in that meeting, and I see what the feedback is. And if it's good, maybe I'll keep wearing that. And over time, it actually becomes a part of my identity. So this study is a really fantastic way to build on that initial 1986 study of possible selves. One of the more interesting studies and important studies of all time, in my view. More recently, Otilia Obudaru, a very cool professor, she previously of the INSEAD school, now at the University of Bath in the UK. She also built on this idea initially with a theoretical paper, meaning there's no data, it's just sort of the development of a theory using the literature, and then a more recent qualitative paper where she actually interviewed people. And what she did to build on this concept of possible selves, is she looked at this idea of foregone professional identities. Again, I'm going to get into a lot of complex terminology here, but it relates to possible selves in sort of a different way. It's the possible selves that I had in my mind in terms of work. I could have been a doctor. I was going to be a dentist at one point. I have this in my self-concept, in my cognition, but I actually don't become that. I didn't become a dentist. And a lot of people, especially as they get into the middle or later stages of their career, really start thinking more and more about these foregone professional identities. What could I have become? What did I think of becoming, but I actually didn't? And how does that impact me in my job now and in terms of my motivations? But let's get into the real purpose of what I was talking about today. So Ottilia Ogudaro's first paper came out in 2012, and around this time there was this sort of burst of papers on the topic of possible selves, and two in particular I find very interesting because they relate to very concrete outcomes in the work world. So first was a paper by a group of proactivity researchers, mainly out of Australia, and what they were looking at. So in this world now, in the 21st century, we have what a lot of people call boundaryless careers, or protean careers, as they say in the paper. And with that, we really have to be more proactive, right? No one is going to manage your career but you. So you have to be quite proactive in doing that, especially when it's not the norm anymore necessarily to stay at the same company for 30 years and just have a clear path ahead. You may move more frequently, you may work in the gig economy for a while. So this idea of proactivity has been studied for quite some time. But there's a question of, how do we get motivated to be proactive? What is it that makes us wake up and say, today I'm going to be proactive, I'm going to network, I'm going to consult about my career, I'm going to seek out career advice? And they actually dove into this realm of possible selves, of identity, because it is so influential. How I see myself, how I define myself, really influences a lot of work outcomes. And so in exploring this paper, they discover a few things here. What they look at is two things matter, namely, for these possible work selves, as they call it, again, relating it more directly to the work domain. So you are more likely to be proactive if the possible selves you envision for yourself are both salient and elaborate. So salient first, meaning it's very accessible in my memory. If I have a possible work self that's sort of very distant and abstract, it's less likely to be impactful on my concrete behaviors, in this case, proactivity behaviors. If it's sort of fuzzy, it's sort of nebulous. But if it's very salient, if it's something I think about every day, it's very accessible in my memory, because I'm so actively thinking about it, it's much more likely to have an impact on my behavior. The other, I said, is elaborate. So if I have one that is elaborate, meaning I've thought a lot about this possible future work self. I've thought about it in different domains, namely. This possible work self I'm envisioning, I see the office I'm going to be sitting in 20 years. I see the relationships I'm going to have. I see who my direct reports are. I see how I treat them day to day, how we work together, the meetings we have. The more elaborate that this identity is, or that this self-concept is for the future, this imagined self-concept, the more likely it is to lead to these proactive behaviors. Like I said, networking and career consultation, that actually have very positive impacts on our work success. Another paper, again, around this same time in the 2012 to 2014 area, where there was this sort of burst of research, less from the organizational behavior realm, more from the psychology realm, was looking at academic success. Again, not work-related, but a similar idea. And what I love about this paper, so they looked at this paper on proactivity and said, okay, yes, salient and elaborate possible selves are likely to impact the future, but they don't always. And why is that the case? Because even if they are very salient and elaborate, it still can be hard to connect with something that's 20 or 30 years out, right? It can still be pretty difficult to think about how my behaviors today, right now, impact that possible self and help me get there. And if something is too distant, this current self I have and this possible future work self, if it's too distant and I can't see the connection anymore, then I'm not really going to do these behaviors, and it's going to fall by the wayside. And the sort of exigencies of the everyday are going to overtake kind of thinking more about the future and trying to get myself to this future goal. So what these authors look at is they bring in conceptual metaphor theory, which I love. I love some of these psychology theories. And conceptual metaphor theory is the idea that I have this target I'm trying to reach that can be very abstract, in this case a possible future self, who I want to become in the future, whether in terms of work success or academic performance. And I have this source, which is a metaphor, right? And it helps make more concrete this abstract future idea. If I can think about it in terms of a metaphor, it actually makes it more concrete, and sort of that's helpful, turning the abstract to the concrete, especially in identity terms. And so the metaphor that they see as helpful, and actually show in a number of studies, 5+ different studies, that helps people in terms of realizing this future identity, is viewing it as a journey, right? Or as in my opening preamble, in quoting Miley, Cyrus, it's about the climb.
It's the climb.
And when you view things, again, just in your head as a metaphor, as this academic path over the next 4 years, it's going to be a journey. And I'll actually show the diagrams here of what they showed research participants, that actually looking, and it's like a path. If I can view my 4 years ahead in terms of academia, or the 10 years ahead before of the next 10 years of my career, if I can view it actually metaphorically as a journey, this connects the current, the present, to the future in a much more direct way that allows me to see, oh, my behaviors now are actually small steps toward that future goal. And it's because if I can see those if I can see the connection between the now and the present, I'm much more likely to engage in those behaviors that move me along this path over time. We have hit on a whole lot of complex psychological and organizational topics here. We've talked about possible selves, provisional selves, foregone professional identities. We've talked about conceptual metaphor theory. I didn't even talk about episodic prospection theory, which is discussed in the proactivity paper, which is the idea that the more elaborate my self-identity is, the reason that helps me is because I'm actually envisioning the future. I'm actually putting myself through the day-to-day of the future. And the more elaborate that is, the more I can sort of plan for potential failures or potential roadblocks, and actually think about how I will get around those in the future. So there's a ton of cool ideas here. This week of rereading a lot of these papers has been fun because, as I mentioned, I'm much more about the concrete parts of organizational behavior and psychology. I never was as into these abstract identity-related concepts. But as I dug into the literature, I realized a lot of these abstract ideas connect to the concrete ideas, much in the same way as conceptual metaphor theory talks about. There's really a journey in between, and if you can see the connection, that's all the better. And in terms of my own reading this week, I was able to see more and more of that connection between the abstract and the very concrete, which was this idea of proactivity and academic success. So that is all for me today. Please do not forget to subscribe, like these other videos, watch these other videos. I will be back next week with a new topic. Feel free to comment if you have a specific idea, because this topic actually came from a friend of mine reaching out saying he wanted to hear more about career success and career transitions. It led to a slightly different place than I intended, but that's the fun part about research, is there's always a new wormhole to dig into. So please comment on what you'd like to see next week. And until then, have a great weekend.